Some people accused this election of being rigged, but in 1974, it very much was rigged. In fact, so rigged that the president had to resign after the whole event. It begins with a man named Richard Nixon. Nixon was sworn in as president in January 1969, but little did America know that along with escalating the Vietnam War, he would get involved in a massive scandal to rig the election. It was 1972 when America would see one of the biggest scandals in recent history. America took a stand against Nixon, and in turn, Nixon stood against them.
We're against a conspiracy by using any means. We are going to use any means that we're...
Watergate was a scandal that was a prime example of taking a stand, where Americans stood together and fought for Nixon's impeachment. They stood against what they believed was wrong by investigating, protesting, and going against orders. Watergate was an influential and crucial turning point that greatly impacted America's history. But let's take a step back. How did this start? And what does this have to do with Nixon? This is the story of Watergate, a stand against the scandal.
The New York Times had published the Pentagon Papers, the Defense Department's secret history of the Vietnam War. Nixon organized a White House plumbers unit to stop any leaks from happening. They broke into a psychiatrist's office to find files on Daniel Ellsberg, the man who leaked the papers. As Nixon's first term as U.S. president neared its end, Nixon ran once more to serve his second term as president. In 1972, on June 17th, there was a break-in at the Democratic National Committee building, the Watergate complex. The burglars had put tape on the door locks, preventing the taped doors from locking. They were coming to try to fix wiretaps that were not working and photograph more campaign documents. A security guard, Frank Wills, noticed the tape on the door. He assumed it was left there by the cleaning crew. He then removed it. He returned a while later and noticed that it had been replaced. He called the police and all 5 burglars were caught, one of whom claimed had worked for the CIA before. At the time, the government did not think much of the case, but after, they realized that one of the burglars from the break-in was James McCord, who was Chief Security Coordinator of the Committee for the Re-election of the President. They then seriously started to investigate the case. 2 reporters named Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward started to investigate the break-in by themselves, taking a stand for what the government, up to that point, had not. President Nixon, when asked about the break-in, denied having anything to do with it. However, Nixon secretly paid hundreds of thousands of dollars in hush money to the burglars. He then made a plan to instruct the CIA to impede the FBI's investigation of the crime.
As the election came closer, more and more instances of the Nixon campaign scandals were found. The Washington Post was a source that took a stand against the Nixon campaign. The Post reported on many of the times when a new Nixon leak had been found. On August 1st, 1972, a cashier's check for $25,000 that was meant for the Nixon campaign ended up in the bank account of one of the Watergate burglars. On October 10th, later that year, the FBI stood against Nixon and reported that the Nixon campaign had been conducting many instances of political spying and sabotage, which was to benefit the Nixon re-election. Keep in mind, the government was not investing resources into researching the Watergate scandal. This information was reported by the Washington Post. The Post was having a hard time obtaining any information about Watergate. Then, a breakthrough happened. One day, a new source was discovered. His name was Mark Felt, but he identified himself under the pseudonym Deep Throat. Felt would arrange secret meetings with Bob Woodward in a garage just over the Key Bridge in Roslyn. Felt would signal a meeting by marking marks in page 20 of Woodward's copy of the New York Times. Felt, who was the associate director for the Committee of the Re-election of the President, had seen the info firsthand on the Watergate file. Felt acted against orders, yet still took a stand for what he knew was right. Over the course of 1973, more of Nixon's scandals began to show. Many of Nixon's White House executives were fired or resigned. Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned during this time as well. The Senate nominated and appointed Gerald Ford to become the new vice president. However, many were unhappy with the removal of White House staff. Because of this, many protests erupted around the nation, much like what happened in this past election. America took a stand against Watergate, uniting against what they knew was a criminal action.
This would begin the Watergate scandal that plagues the White House name today. Over the course of the next year, Nixon would defend his innocence with the scandal. He would restate that he was, quote, not a crook.
I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Nixon wanted to establish to all of the U.S. that he had nothing to do with the scandal. On November 11, 1972, Richard Nixon was re-elected in one of America's largest landslides. Nixon won 60% of the vote over the Democratic nominee, George McGovern. This was when the secret scandals the campaign had committed paid off. Nixon had won the Electoral College vote in a huge landslide. He won the vote with a massive figure of 520 to the measly 17 votes McGovern possessed. McGovern won only 2 areas, Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. American voters had taken a stand against McGovern, choosing to re-elect Richard Milhous Nixon. In April 1974, judges from the Supreme House Judiciary Committee received over 1,000 written papers of White House tape recordings. These had been edited and could very well have been adapted from the original recordings. The committee would not stand for this. They demanded that the White House tape recordings be handed over. The House Judiciary Committee took a stand against Nixon. They unanimously decided that Nixon release 64 White House tape recordings. Nixon claimed he had a right not to follow this order with his executive privilege, but the House would not have it. They did not budge from their original orders for Nixon to release the tapes that would help solve the Watergate scandal. The House Judiciary Committee passed one of 3 impeachment articles, voting 27-11, deciding that Nixon had been guilty of obstruction of justice. The next article of impeachment was abuse of power. This again was passed, voting 28-10. Article 3, the contempt of Congress, was passed, voting 21-17. Nixon was in a bad situation. All 3 articles of impeachment were passed on Nixon.
Nixon, facing certain impeachment, decided to resign from his position as president on August 8, 1974.
I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
He would have been impeached from office if he hadn't been the first and only president to resign. Gerald Ford picked up the reins of the Oval Office, and as one of his first orders, pardoned Nixon of all charges. Watergate was a scandal that was a prime example of taking a stand, where Americans stood together and fought for Nixon's impeachment. They stood against what they believed was wrong, by investigating, protesting, and going against orders. Watergate was an influential and crucial turning point that greatly impacted America's history.
The power I had as president. And thirdly, I put the American people through 2 years of needless agony, and I apologize for that. And I know how difficult it is for anyone, and most of all you, but I think that people need to hear it, and I think unless you say it, you're going to be haunted for the rest of your life.
I let down my friends. I let down the country. I let down our system of government, and the dreams of all those young people that ought to get into government but will think it's all too corrupt and the rest. Most of all, I let down an opportunity that I would have had for 2.5 more years to proceed on great projects and programs for building a lasting peace. Of that
well, we've had our
the
discussion
lawyers
on that,
can argue
we
that
disagree
out.
on that, but that's
I did not commit, in my view, an impeachable offense. But even if I'd won in the Senate by a vote or 2, I would have been crippled. And in any event, for 6 months, the country couldn't afford having the president in the dock in the United States Senate. And there can never be an impeachment in the future in this country without a president voluntarily impeaching himself. I have impeached myself.